Okay. Good evening and a warm welcome once again to the 8th lecture of the National Conference. Today we have Dr. Manu V. Devadevan. He's speaking from Himachal Pradesh, very far away. It's a pleasant evening, and the moderator for today is our MPhil scholar, Ajay Joy. He is working on Dutch trade and native merchants of Cochin. Over to you, Ajay, to take over the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Shibhavan. Thank you. A very good evening once again, a very good evening and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for the 8th session of 7-day online national conference conducted by the Department of History, Sri Shankara University of Sanskrit College in honor of Dr. Paslithil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. The ongoing theme of this webinar is Critique and Constructions and our writings on histories of Kerala. This webinar provides a platform to interact with a new generation of historians and social scientists working on Kerala's past, bringing forward a revised version of existing assumptions and delving into fresh perspectives and conceptualizations. Today, we have among us one of the distinguished scholar, Dr. Manu V. Devadevan, to enlighten us on the topic, the life and the times of Narayana Guru, preliminary thought on his changing worldview. Before we move forward with the session, I will be reading out a set of general instructions for the participants. All the participants are requested to mute their audio and turn off their video throughout the session. Attendance of the participant will be automatically recorded. If any of the participants accidentally leave and are unable to join the session, they can continue with us through our live streaming in YouTube. Also, if you have any queries in between the session, please send them to the chat box or as a comment in YouTube, and I will be reading it out to the speaker on your behalf at the end of the session. Without further ado, I will invite our PG student Amisha to formally introduce Dr. Manu V. Devadevan and for the welcome address. Over to you, Amisha.
Thank you so much, Ajay, and a warm welcome to the 8th lecture of the International Conference. It's indeed my pleasure to introduce the distinguished speaker, Dr. Manu V. Devadevan, for the day, who is here to deliver the talk. Dr. Manu V. Devadevan currently works at School of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi. He is the author of A Prehistory of Hinduism and the Early Medieval Origins of India. He specializes in political economy of pre-colonial South India. Dr. Manu V. Devadevan completed his postgraduate degree from JNU and doctoral research from Mangalore University under Keshavan Veluthar. He has been awarded the Infosys Prize for Humanities in 2019. As per the citation, the prize has been awarded for his highly original and wide-ranging work on pre-modern South India. Welcome, sir, and we are delightful to have you here. A warm welcome to all the participants to the lecture. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Dr. Manu? Dr. Manu, can you hear us?
Hello.
Yes.
Sorry,
yes.
I get my audio mute. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure we can.
Yeah. Thank you, Ajay and Amisha, for that generous introduction. It's a great privilege to be with you today, to participate in this event held in honor of Dr. Paslithil and Dr. Narayanan. Thank you, Dr. Shiba, for having me here. I want to share some thoughts with you on Narayana Guru. This is part of a set of works in progress in which I am expanding the scope of one of my earlier works, Prehistory of Hinduism, into the 19th and 20th century. I'm studying the lives of a few Indian saints of the last 200 years. Narayana Guru from Kerala, Ramana Maharshi from Tamil Nadu, Lakshmanju from Kashmir, Nisargadatta Maharaj from Maharashtra, Siddharuda from Karnataka, and several others. Ananda Mahima from Bengal, Mahima Gosai from Odisha, and so on. So today I'll share my preliminary thoughts on Narayana Guru. Narayana Guru needs no introduction to Kerala audience. All of us present here know of his life and work too well. He's been studied widely, commented upon extensively, and invoked for a wide range of purposes, including purposes that are expressly political. Even so, writing about Guru with a historical sense is not really easy for a variety of reasons. That's what I realized while looking at his life. A part of the reason is that Guru is too alive in our midst, even now, in passionate and ambivalent ways, to make a detached retrospective appraisal of his life and work possible. Guru is a key figure in existing accounts of Kerala's transformation. Assessments concerning his life and times have been plentiful, amounting to what I believe is a surplus production of knowledge, so to speak. He's generally regarded as a reformer who challenged caste and religious prejudices and preached equality. Existing views concerning his life and work are unanimous on this particular account, but they, however, tend to differ in points of emphasis while drawing an historical estimate of his personality. Some writers regard him as an embodiment of ancient philosophical and ascetic wisdom, marking the continuation of the Vedanta and Shaiva Siddhanta traditions. Others who don't necessarily disagree with this view place him alongside the Buddha, Basava, Jyotiba Phule, and such other figures in a narrative of long-standing dissent and protest. Dissent and protest against the orthodox beliefs and practices. Yet others regard him as registering a break with the past and contributing to the evolution of a modern subjectivity by promoting ideals of justice, egalitarianism, fraternity. These writers, that is the last group, consist of mostly serious academic researchers. They do not insist that Guru's engagement with philosophical traditions of India represents, what shall I say, a continuity of sorts. In their judgment, what it involved was a critique, a reinterpretation of a set of old world wisdom that spoke to the new world in an idiom that had few parallels in the old world. This position is sober. It is a sober position, less prone to represent wishful thinking as facts, and has, I guess, greater acceptance among historians. There is also a narrower view, a much narrower view, which represents Guru as a reformer of the Irava caste into which he was born. Guru was closely associated for several years with the Sri Narayana Dharma Paripalana Yogam, SNDP, an organization that was on the forefront of the Irava reform project. In the lecture today, I'll present a brief biographical account of Narayana Guru. From the time of his birth in the mid-1850s to his demise in 1928. This is a story that all of us know pretty well. And in this sense, I'm only rehashing what you already know. But in doing so, I'll point to a few instances of changes that Guru's thoughts underwent in the course of his life. In the existing literature on Narayana Guru, which as I said is rather copious, we generally do not come across discussions of the changes in his patterns of thinking. We only see his thought being presented or subjected to a synchronic appraisal. This is the lacuna that I want to address. So please bear with me if only 7 or 8 minutes of my lecture tells you something that is new, and the greater part of the lecture sounds like stories that you're already familiar with. There are many things that I'll not touch upon. I'll not speak about Guru's relationship with or influence on several of his contemporaries. Ayyangali, Sahodaran Ayyappan, Chattambi Swami. That is a long history in itself. I'm also not going to touch upon his conversations with many of his contemporaries, with Gandhi, for instance, or with Tagore. I don't think we have the time to examine all these aspects. Now, I have a draft of a paper with me, which I produced for some other purpose. Since there's a lot of data in it, there's also excerpts from his poems and so on. I'll read the draft. So let's start. Narayana Guru was a saint, a sannyasi. He wouldn't have regarded this description as holding the key to an appreciation of his life, for he had chosen to identify himself as a guru rather than a sannyasi. He was a saint nonetheless, and his saintliness was characterized by serenity and solicitude, commanding at the same time an authority that Max Weber wouldn't have hesitated to describe as charismatic. Guru's life and work have inspired a vast body of hagiographic, reformist, philosophical, and political writings. The greater part of these is in Malayalam. His name is generally invoked along with the Advaita saint Shankaras in defining the Malayali identity. Nearly 50 biographical accounts of his life have been written in Malayalam alone, which mostly draw larger-than-life pictures of the saint. Even the most nuanced of accounts, which aren't too many in number, often get into the patronizing mode that is more panegyric than biography. These narratives generally mirror one another in their broad outlines. At the same time, they tend to disagree over many of the details, especially with respect to the facts concerning the first 3 decades of his life. Guru was a sannyasi, but he became a sannyasi without taking the initiation meant to become one, without taking the sannyasa diksha. The practice of sannyasa is more than 2,500 years old. We come across the first sannyasis in India around 650 or 600 BC. The Buddha had several contemporaries who were sannyasis, and in a few cases, we know of the Guru Parampara of sannyasis extending up to 2 or 3 generations. That would be 600 or 650 BC. This was a time when sannyasa was a specific way of life. There were 3 other ways of life: brahmacharya, grihastha, and vanaprastha. These were not 4 successive stages in life. These were not 4 successive stages in life. They were only 4 distinct ways of life. One could choose to be a brahmachari or a grihastha or take to vanaprastha and sannyasa. They came to be represented as 4 successive stages of life only from the time of the Manusmriti. Many of you may be familiar with this. Patrick Olivelle has written about this. All 4 stages required the individual to go through an initiation, that is a diksha. The initiation into grihastha was not called diksha, it was called marriage. That's a different story. But one became a sannyasi by initiation, by diksha. This long-standing tradition is what Narayana Guru breaks. He becomes a sannyasi without a mantra diksha from a mantra guru, and he inaugurates a tradition in which people become sannyasis without mantra diksha or specific ascetic practices that are known to the serious practitioners as sadhana or sadhagam, as it's called in Kerala. In this scheme of things, the darshana that was part of sannyasa was not what it used to be for 2,500 years. Darshana was what you knew beforehand and then realized or internalized through ascetic practices. It involved the attainment of nirvana, kevalajnana, vajrakaya, jivan mukti, shatsthala, sahasrara, and various other such states of mind. With Narayana Guru, the darshana becomes a system of knowledge that had to be learnt theoretically and used as a guiding factor to create a better world, an egalitarian world. This was a whole new way of engaging with the idea of darshana. Now, the darshana was itself not static or unchanging. Guru's darshana changed over time. I'll come to that in a while. Sometime in the later half of the 1880s, Narayana Guru established a temple for Shiva on the banks of the Neyyar at Arivipuram near Thiruvananthapuram. All of you, I guess, know the details of this. This is his first major public act that we know of. It took several years for the temple to take shape. Work began with a momentous event in which Narayana Guru consecrated a round boulder from the Neyyar as a Shivalinga on a rock surface. There are no eyewitness accounts of these events, and we have no means to ascertain its date. All biographies agree that it occurred on the Shivaratri in the Malayalam era 1063, the Kollam era, which corresponds to 10th of February 1888. While some biographers mention this Gregorian date, others place the event on different dates, even while insisting that it was a Shivaratri. One such date is 12th of March 1888. There are biographers who mention the month in the solar calendar as Kumbhamasam, but Kumbham in 1888 commenced only on the 14th of February, which makes the 10th of February date look out of place. Now, very little is known of Guru's life before this event. He was born to a couple of the Irava caste in the Principality of Thiruvidampur at Chembarandi in what was then the forested outskirts of Thiruvananthapuram, 12 kilometers northwest of the city's famous Padmanabha Swami temple. The year of his birth is variously recorded as 1854, 1855, and 1856. These were momentous times in the history of Thiruvidampur. This little state on India's southwestern coast was ruled at this time by Uttram Tirunal Marthandavarma. In 1855, very close to the date of Narayana Guru's birth, the British resident William Cullen persuaded the king to effectively abolish slavery and slave trade, which had continued to be prevalent widely even after its ban in 1812 by the Queen Ayilyam Tirunal Gauri Lakshmi Bai at the instance of the then resident John Munro. Thiruvidampur was not an egalitarian regime, as it were. There were limits to its progressive credentials. In 1859, the king and the resident were both less enthusiastic when the presidency of Madras insisted that Thiruvidampur concede to the demands made by the Nadar women to cover their breasts like Nair women. Munro's order of 1812 had allowed women converts to Christianity to cover their breasts, as obtained among Christians in other countries. That's a quote from his order. But Gauri Lakshmi Bai's proclamation of 1814 insisted that they wear only jackets or bodices in the manner of Syrian Christian and Mapila Muslims. Other women from lower castes were allowed this privilege only upon payment of a fee known as Mulakkaram, that is the breast tax. Uttram Tirunal's proclamation of 1859 allowed all Nadar women to cover their breast in any manner whatsoever, but not like women of high caste. They were not expected to imitate high-class women. The breast tax continued to be in force until 1865, when Uttram Tirunal's successor, Ayilyam Tirunal Ramavarma, repealed it. Guru's family, Vailvaram is believed to be the name of his family, was relatively well off and owned farmland in the village. It appears to have maintained some connections with the royal family, although we are not sure how deep these connections were. Guru's father, Kuchulail Madanashan, was a traditional teacher. Among Madanashan's two wives was Guru's mother, Kutti, whose brothers, Raman Vaidyan and Krishnan Vaidyan, were respected Ayurvedic physicians and Sanskrit scholars. Kutti's maternal uncle was also well versed in Sanskrit. Narayana Guru had three sisters, Devi Amma, Koche, and Mada. Now, biographies have been wont to represent Narayana Guru as a compassionate genius from his very birth. Commenting on his contemplative bearings, they write that even as a child, he was mostly lost in thoughts. Now, while one should be rightfully skeptical of claims concerning born geniuses, there is reason to believe that the circumstances of his life made Guru spend long hours in thought. Chembarandi was home to three caste groups, the Nairs, the Iravas, and the Polayas, living in a graded hierarchy of untouchability. Existing caste norms necessitated them to maintain prescribed physical distance, lest they polluted the castes above them. The Nayars were regarded as Savarnas, that is part of the fourfold Varna classification, and the Eedavas and the Pulayas, Avarnas, falling outside this scheme of things. The Eedavas occupied a higher position among the Avarnas, and the Pulayas, who served as agrestic laborers, were among the lowest in the hierarchy, second only to the Parayas. The Eedavas were believed to pollute the Nayar, and they were both in turn thought to be polluted by the Pulayas. Guru had few Eedava friends of his age to play with, and was prevented from contacts with Pulaya children, of which there were a certain number working on the Vailvaram family's fields. His contemplative bent of mind seems to have had its roots in the long years of loneliness in childhood and adolescence, which also made him ask hard questions on the human condition from very early times. It is then not surprising that anecdotes from his young days represent Nanu, as he was affectionately addressed, as a rebellious boy who any act of injustice or violence moved profoundly. Gobbling up fruits set aside for the deities even before the worship was completed is thought to have been one of his cherished pranks. Another pastime was to touch Pulaya boys whenever an opportunity presented itself, and return home without going through the bath of purification to hug his family members and transmit to them the pollution thereof. On one occasion, he is said to have wept bitterly when a few young boys pelted stones at a saint passing through the village. We are also told that he contracted smallpox when he was stealthily nursing an abandoned Pulaya boy out of the disease. Without letting the family have a wind of it, he retired to an abandoned temple for a few days to keep the spread of the disease in check, returning home only when he was cured. Lonely at home with few friends for company, he spent long hours away from residence, mostly in the adjoining wilds, perhaps with a million questions in his mind about the atomized existence that the conventions of his times had forced him into. He also spent long hours in prayers, earning him the nickname Nanu Bhaktan. Home was his first school. Madanashan taught him how to read and write Malayalam and Sanskrit, as well as basic arithmetic. From his uncles, Raman Vaidyan and Krishnan Vaidyan, he learned the essentials of Sanskrit, which involved memorizing texts such as the Amarakosha, the Siddharupam, the Balaprabodham, and the Sri Ramodantam. Krishnan Vaidyan also taught the boy the fundamentals of Ayurveda. These were followed by a few years of training under a local teacher of some renown, Chembarandi Mutabilla, who might have taught Narayana Guru short kavya texts in Sanskrit and some astrology as well. In the later half of the 1870s, he spent a few years near Karunagapalli studying with a renowned teacher, Kummamballi Ramanashan. It was in this school of some 60-odd students that he faced serious discrimination from classmates coming from the upper castes. Nanu turned out to be the best in the class, and Ramanashan appointed him Chattambi, that is a class monitor. He lived in the Varanapalli family of the philanthropist Kochi Krishna Panikar, who arranged for boarding and food for Eedava students in Ramanashan's school. Nanu Chattambi seems to have developed a cherishing camaraderie with some of his classmates, including Perunalli Krishnan Vaidyar and Velutteri Keshavan Vaidyar, who both went on to become much admired literateurs in the following decades. The 3 years of higher learning in Karunagapalli, which biographers place in the years 1876 to 79, came to an end when Nanu Chattambi had to return home following a severe intestinal disorder. After recovery, he settled down for a while in Chembarandi to teach in an informal school that the family had set up to keep him from wandering. Whether or not he loved teaching, we must believe that Nanu Ashan, that is Nanu the teacher, was fairly good in his profession. He accepted invitations to start a school at Kadakkavur and another at Anjadanga. two adjoining settlements about 25 kilometers north of Chembarandi. In his early days as a school teacher in 1881, he wrote two short pieces of philosophical reflections in prose, the Chijjada Chintanam and the Daiva Chintanam. These were among the few prose compositions that he wrote. Soon, his family forced him into a marriage. The bride, Kali, was Madanashan's niece. The wedding took place in the absence of the groom, as was the practice at the time. With little interest in married life, Narayana Guru left home immediately. There are at least three versions of what ensued. The most popular of them is that he never returned home and the wedding was not consummated. Another version has it that he was persuaded to return. He lived with Kali until her untimely death a little later. The third story, which on the face of it appears to be the most credible, has it that his family brought him back and Narayana Guru remained a householder for 2 or 3 years, after which the relationship fell apart. His mother had died sometime during these years. In 1884, when he had completed 4 years as a school teacher, his father passed away. Biographers tell us that these deaths, the death of his father and mother, released him from worldly bondages. Quite the contrary, it seems to me. The death of his parents shortly after his father, the death of his father shortly after the death of his mother, might have made him feel helpless and vulnerable as never before. At least 6 of his devotional poems have been traced to this year, 1884. These are the oldest surviving poems that he wrote. One of them, Navamanjari, is a moving appeal to Murugan to rid him of his sorrow. In this poem, Narayana Guru writes, "Are you the child of Himalaya's daughter, and I, bowing at your feet, both are children? What fairness is this, son of the master? But won't a turn in my fate or your mercy on me, your slave, bring you successfully to the state of a little child?" This is the 7th verse of Navamanjari. Manya vidan kamani kunyaya ninjarama kanjaya veenupani. I'll not read the whole text. In the same work, he makes an appeal to Murugan. Come as a wanderer, stand near me, bring down my grief if you wish, with your lance bright with 1,000 rays. Muruga, there's no escape in letting go your name when the waters of hell appear, but one has to only stand melting down. This is the 3rd stanza. Yennai vannarigil ninnayiram kadir paranna bhayulla vadivel. That is the stanza. This is the translation of this particular verse. The letters with which the 9 stanzas of this poem commence, placed one after the other in that order, form the phrase Narayana Krita Manjari. The Navamanjari and the other 1884 poems, Guhashtagam, Vasudevashtagam, Bhadragali-ashtagam and Vinayaka-ashtagam, are impassioned devotional pieces with an alliterative force that charge them with a rare intensity. I have not been able to trace the Vairagya Dashakam, which Nataraja Guru lists in the poems of 1884. I guess it was never published. But when you look at the 5 existing poems, we realize that never again do we come across such forceful poems with an emotional intensity, except perhaps in the Bahuleya Ashtakam, written sometime between 1887 and 1897. Now, between 1884 and 1888, Narayana Guru was mostly wandering across southern Tiruvidampur. He met Punjamilla, a yogi who identified himself as Shanmukadasan and went on to attain renown as Chattambi Swami. Shanmukadasan introduced Narayana Guru to Taikat Ayyavu Swami, an exceptional English-speaking yogi from Tamil Nadu who held office as manager of the residency under Atal MacGregor. Narayana Guru attained proficiency in Hatha Yoga under Ayyavu Swami's guidance. He continued to wander for many more years, in forests, across villages, through the sea beach, and in hamlets of the fishing community. He spent the last phase of his travel in a rock shelter called Pillattadam on the Marutvamala hill, 7 kilometers northwest of Kanyakumari. one of the most beautiful hills in this part of the country with a water spring that has now dried up, the Marutvamala offered breathtaking views of the verdant plains below and the blue sea beyond the plains. If any of you have not visited Marutvamala, I would actually strongly recommend you to go there. It's a wonderful place to be. Here, he is believed to have spent his days in seclusion, allegedly in the company of leopards and serpents, descending down the hill only to beg for food in the adjoining villages. He lived in the cave, we don't know for how long, until some villagers found him there and realized that he was a saint. His life of wandering in solitude came to an end here. When he walked northwards, leaving the hill behind, the mission of his life had perhaps taken a clear shape in his mind. Narayana Guru arrived in Aruvipuram, 20 kilometers southeast of Thiruvananthapuram, and spent a few months here in meditation and interactions with the locals. His apprenticeship in Ayurveda helped him cure many people of various illnesses, and his pragmatic counsel enabled several others to find work in coir weaving and other such local cottage industry. These were miracles enough in the Tiruvidangur of the late 19th century to draw a steady stream of devout followers. With their support, he mobilized labor and funds for building the historic temple of Aruvipuram. Symbolic as it was, installation of the Shivalinga at Aruvipuram was a revolutionary act that challenged the existing caste structure in Kerala. It was possible in Kerala for a non-Brahmana to build a temple or install an image, so long as it was a private shrine or a place meant for a specific caste. Public temples, which cannot justifiably be represented as public owing to the fact that about 3/4 of the population were denied entry, public temples had to have images installed by a Brahmana priest on the lines of scriptural prescription, the scripture being Narayana's Tantra Samuchaya, a 16th century text. A non-Brahmana installing an image for what would be a public shrine without following the Tantra Samuchaya was a rejection of many an existing religious and caste conventions. It is surprising that the incident did not lead to a confrontation. All that we hear is that a few orthodox men questioned Narayana Guru's credentials for installing the image, only to be told that it was an Irava Shiva that he had installed. This is the official version of the story, but in more recent years, another report has been in circulation which purges the words attributed to Guru of their caste content. In this version, which is seen, for instance, in P.A. Bakkar's 1986 biopic, Sri Narayana Guru, it is our Shiva, Nammuda Shivan, that is installed, not the Shiva of a particular caste. In the Aruvipuram temple, Narayana Guru caused a Malayalam quatrain in the Anushtup meter to be inscribed, which in translation reads, "This is the place exemplary where everyone dwells fraternally with no differences of caste or of sectarian hate." The famous Jati Bedam Madadvesham verse. This has been one of the best loved verses in Malayalam ever since. The Aruvipuram temple became a center of attraction in no time, and a regular stream of pilgrims began to arrive there, mostly for offering the Shraddha food, or Bali, as it is called in Kerala, to the mains on select Vavu days. Vavu is the new moon day. A committee was entrusted with, an 11-member committee was formed. This committee was entrusted with handling the pilgrims, and the Vavuttu Yogam, as the committee came to be known, was placed in charge of Padmanabhan Parameshwaran, younger brother of Padmanabhan Velayudhan, who was the first Irava to earn an undergraduate degree. The committee was registered as a trust under the name Aruvipuram Kshetra Yogam in 1899. In the years after founding the Aruvipuram temple, Guru repeated the experiment at a number of places, establishing temples in which he installed Shiva, Devi, Subramanya, and other such Pauranic deities. The first of these was at Vakkam, the village to the immediate north of Anjadanga. Here, he built the Deveshwaram temple for Shiva, besides renewing the old image of Subramanya at the Velayudhan temple. It was during his visits to the Velayudan temple that he regularly met Kumaru, who became one of his early disciples and rose to evolve as one of the most influential poets in 20th century literature in Malayalam, Kumaranashan. The temple movement gained traction in the following years. He built several temples in various parts of Kerala and one in Karnataka, the Gokarnanatha temple at Kudroli near Mangalore. At many places, he changed old local deities that demanded animal sacrifices with Pauranic ones, mostly by replacing the existing image, but at times by raising existing shrines. The first of these was in Mannandala, where he replaced the local goddess with Devi. In Kulattur, 5 kilometers southwest of Jembarandi, he replaced bloodthirsty Kali with Shiva. At least one temple complex that he raised to replace the existing deity was in Tamil Nadu, the Pillayar Kovil temple for Ganapati at Kottar, 15 kilometers northwest of Kanyakumari. Now, enthusiasts produced lists with over 80 temples which Guru built or where he replaced old images with new ones. But we can't be sure if the actual number of temples exceeded 40. Some of the stotras that he wrote between 1888 and 1897 were meant for purposes of worship in the new temples. The Mannandala Devi Stavam, for instance, was for use in the Devi temple at Mannandala. The Kolathiresha Stavam for worship in the Kulattur Shiva temple, and so on. The stotras and stutis that he composed between 1884 and 1897 carried the influence of two sources. The ideational component of Advaita Vedanta and the affective aspect of the Tamil Tirumurai tradition, Tirumurai compositions. As this phase of his life began to draw to a close, Narayana Guru appears to have gravitated towards Advaita in substantial measures. Between 1887 and 1897, he composed songs such as the Kundalini Patu and the Kali Natakam, as well as several stotras like the Chidambarashtakam, the Shanmukashtakam, the Sadashiva Darshanam, and the Bahule Ashtakam, but also produced philosophical texts with a strong Advaitic core, such as the Brahma Vidya Panchakam and the Advaita Deepika, and a Malayalam translation of the Ishavasya Upanishad. Another product of these years, the Indriya Vairagyam, tried to bring the two tendencies together. That is, it tried to bring Advaita Vedanta and the Tirumurai philosophy together. By 1897, he had already rendered a few Tamil works into Malayalam, including parts of the Tirukural of Tiruvalluvar. His decisive turn to Advaita is noticed in the Atmopadesha Shatakam of 1897. These 100 verses of self-instruction were unique for the manner in which it approached the self. In the very second verse of the text, he laid out his understanding of the self in unambiguous terms. Everything from the Karanas, Karanas is the Manasa, Buddhi, Ahankaram and Chitta, everything from the Karanas, the sense organs and the body, to all the known world is but the sacred body of the bright being that arose in the great void. Here, the self was the visible, the vehicle that led one to the divine. The self was the vehicle that led one to the divine. Please note this point. And inasmuch as everything was the sacred body of the divine, the other was as imbued with the divine as the self was. This was not all theology or metaphysics. In a stroke of effective genius, the Atmopadesha Shatakam transformed the divine relationship with the other into an ethical relationship, making the other a crucial factor in defining the self. Here is one of the verses. This is verse number 21. What's dear is one of its kind. There arises obsession over the dear object in manifold ways, dear to me, dear to you, dear to the other. What's dear to oneself should be understood as dear to the other. And so on it goes. The next few stanzas, I'll not read them all out here. They all express the same sentiment. This is the set of verse beginning from verse number 21. Priyamoru jadi then priyam tvadiya priyam apara priyam en anegamai Priya Vishayam Pradi Vannidum Brahmam, Tan Priyam Abarapriyam Naringidam. And then there are 5-6 more verses where this idea that he presents here is getting unpacked. The other had appeared time and again in the long history of India's devotional literature as a being that deserves compassion, but rarely had the other been a constitutive factor in defining the self. The Atmopadesha Shatakam had a tone and vocabulary that paled into insignificance in front of the emotional intensity of the 1884 compositions, but the text was certainly breaking new ground. The temples that Narayana Guru built did not follow existing worship patterns. The stotras and stuti liturgies in these temples were not drawn from the Vedas, Agamas, and other widely used sources, but composed by Guru himself. In 1924, 4 years before his demise, he introduced fire worship through the Homa ritual and composed a Homa mantram for Agni, rejecting the traditional patterns for performing Homa. The deities that he promoted were drawn from the Pauranic pantheon. Local deities in Kerala were generally offered liquor, meat, and animal sacrifices. These deities, Bhudattan, Chudalamadan, Ishakki, Irulan, Karuppan, and many more, were worshipped in iconic forms or as pedestals, peedhams, where they were thought to be residing. Narayana Guru caused many such images and pedestals to be removed, also suspending animal sacrifice and the practice of offering meat and liquor associated with them. His solitary wanderlust was the first casualty after Arivipuram shot him into fame. His travels did not cease, though. It was as if Guru was born to be always on the move. He was now accompanied by a growing coterie of followers. The Arivipuram temple was his base for nearly a decade and a half, but the crowd thronging the temple began to swell over the years. The Shivaratri of 1896, for instance, attracted as many as 10,000 people, most of them thought to be Iravas. This made Narayana Guru look for an alternative seat. And in 1904, he established a monastery, a matha, on the Shivagiri hill near Varkala, 25 kilometers southeast of Kollam, which became his new headquarters. Winds of change had begun to blow over Kerala in these years. This had to do largely with the gradual disintegration of existing land relations, which were primarily agrarian relations, into which labor relations were deeply embedded. The state metamorphosed into an institution governed by the rule of law rather than convention or political discretion, bringing in its train a new labor market premised on the principles of uninherited labor. This new form of labor changed the substance and semantics of work substantially. In the 18th century, Martanda Varma and Tipu Sultan had already initiated the liquidation of widespread local and regional militias in Tiruvidangur and Mysore, albeit on a limited scale. This strategic exercise received a definitive treatment in the hands of Governor General Wellesley, who introduced the policy of subsidiary alliance, in which the Indian states and principalities were expected to ally with the British in a subordinate status, disbanding their armies. A vibrant military labor market that had defined political fortunes in India for hundreds of years collapsed, making this vast multitude depend increasingly on agriculture. The rise of the new labor market, which was not governed by inheritance of one's vocation, was coeval to a phase of tremendous expansion in agriculture and the ruralization of the economy in various parts of Indian subcontinent that the disbanding of the armies and militias had caused. These developments were not alien to Kerala. It led, inter alia, to an unprecedented intensification of agrarian servitude and despondency that was already rampant for several centuries. The state and the emerging labor market did not generate sufficient employment for a large and mostly unlettered population. Tiruvidangur had in the meantime begun to show a preference for Brahmanas from Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka for appointment into its services, with 45% of all positions occupied by these groups. This turned out to be a cause for grievance among Malayalis, who had begun to benefit from Western education in increasing numbers. Western education had already had a century-long presence in Kerala by this time. In 1793, a year after the Treaty of Srirangapatna, in which Tipu Sultan ceded Malabar to the British, Father Gabriel Gonzalez of the Devamata Cathedral in Kozhikode started the St. Joseph's Boys Higher Secondary School in the city. Known at the time as St. Joseph's European School, it was meant for the children of the East India Company employees. This was the first modern school to be set up in Kerala. In 1836, the Thiruvidankur ruler Swathi Tirunal established the Maharaja's Free School, the first government school in the principality. By this time, Christian missionaries had set up scores of schools in the areas governed by Thiruvidankur. Between late 1813 and early 1817, Reverend William Ringletop founded no less than 7 schools, imparting instructions to 188 students. These were single teacher schools. The first CMS missionary in Kerala, Reverend Thomas Norton, started a school in Alappuzha in 1817, where up to 50 boys studied. His wife founded a school for girls in Alappuzha in 1820. Between 1817 and 1820, Thomas Norton established 2 schools, one each in Mattanjeri and Kodungalur. Dawson's successor, Samuel Ridsdale, founded 6 boys' schools for 294 students and 4 girls' schools for 64 students. In 1825, or shortly thereafter, Mrs. Fern and Mrs. Baker started the Missions Girls' School in Kottayam. By 1824, there were as many as 47 missionary schools in Thiruvidankur, to which over 1,300 students went. Missionary schools expanded in subsequent decades on a phenomenal scale, so much so that by 1908, there were 2,198 schools run by various evangelical missions alone. Higher education also received attention, if on a lesser scale. The Church Missionary Society of London had established the College Kottayam at Kottayam in 1815, the second college to be set up in India after the government Sanskrit College of Varanasi, 1791. CMS College, as it is now known, became functional in 1817 with the missionary Benjamin Bailey as its head. More colleges appeared in the subsequent years. His Highness the Maharaja's College, now called the University College, started functioning in Thiruvananthapuram in 1866, and the Zamorin's College of Kozhikode, Guruvayurappan College now, in 1877. The elementary English school, Ernakulam, established in 1845, was upgraded as the Ernakulam College, the Maharaja College now, that was in 1875, and the free school founded in Talasheri in 1862 was upgraded into a second-grade college in 1890. This was the Brennan College. In Thiruvidankur, it is estimated that almost every Nair family had sent at least one of its children to a government school by 1890, with 300 of them successful in passing the matriculation examinations by this date. The Eedavas put up a less impressive record on this count. Even so, literacy among them had made rapid strides, reaching 12% in 1891 from a mere 3% 2 decades earlier. The men who went to these schools and colleges looked for job with the government. When positions in the Thiruvidankur administration was not open to them, they were justly aggrieved. Of the 3,407 positions with a salary of rupees 10 and above, 1,440 were occupied by non-Malayalis, with not a single Malayali in the class drawing a salary of rupees 500 and above. Just give me a moment. Let me drink a glass of water. Yeah. Most Malayalis in government service came from the Nair caste. Deprived of making it to the higher ranks of the administration, they came into conflict with the non-Malayali Brahmana groups. In 1877, a student of the Maharaja College in Thiruvananthapuram, C. Krishnapilla, organized an informal group called the Malayali Social Union in the college with the support of one of his teachers, P. Thanupilla. It became the Malayali Sabha in 1884, publishing a periodical called Malayali from 1886 with the renowned novelist C.V. Ramapilla as editor. In 1890, two advocates associated with the Malayali Sabha, Govindan Parameswaran Pilla and K.P. Shankara Menon, together with a few others, K.P. Padmanabha Menon, C.V. and others, wrote a petition expressing concern over the government's preference for non-Malayalis in the administration. Known as the Malayali Memorial, this petition with 10,028 signatories was submitted to the king in January 1891. The government chose not to concede to the demands immediately. The petition fell flat, although prolonged negotiations helped some of the leaders behind the petition to earn plump positions in the Tiruvidanger administration. These beneficiaries were all Nayars, or at least mostly Nayars. We have information concerning only 250 of the 10,000 odd signatories. And as it turns out, 168 of them were Nayars, of which 90 were landlords, 55 were current or retired government employees, and 23 advocates. Ingrained in the Malayali Memorial were deep-seated class and caste prejudices, which served to recast caste equations in Kerala. In the long run, it drove the new literate classes and participants in the emerging public sphere to organize themselves to make their presence felt in the evolving political economy by forming associations along the caste lines, which was a long-drawn process and not an immediate fallout of the Malayali Memorial's failure. Padmanabhan Velayudan, the first Izhava to earn a college degree, was one of the signatories of the Malayali Memorial. The first Izhava to earn a medical degree had also affixed his signature to this petition. A brother of Velayudan's, Padmanabhan Palpu, was in fact the third signatory to the Malayali Memorial. Palpu was earlier denied admission for a medical degree in Tiruvidanger because of his caste and had to enroll for the course in Madras. And like Velayudan, he had to find work in British service in the Madras presidency as Tiruvidanger was unwilling to employ an Izhava. 3 decades earlier, in 1865, their father, P.T. Palpu, was denied permission to appear for the first pleader's examination for the same reason. Sometime between 1890 and 1894, Palpu was introduced to Narayana Guru by his other brother, Parameswaran, who was in charge of the Aravipuram Kshetra Yogam. A close bond began to develop between Palpu, Guru, and Kumaranashan in the years to come. In the meantime, Palpu produced a petition to the Tiruvidanger government seeking jobs for Izhavas under the aegis of the Izhava Sabha that he had constituted. Signed by 13,176 Izhavas, the Izhava Memorial was submitted to the king in September 1896. When the government's response turned out to be far from encouraging, another petition was submitted to the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, in 1900. Curzon didn't entertain the petition either. Now, Palpu persuaded Narayana Guru to transform the Aravipuram Kshetra Yogam into a large organization that would pioneer a mass movement. Thus was born the Aravipuram Sri Narayana Dharma Paripalana Yogam, that's his official name, incorporated as a company under the Indian Companies Act of 1882 as applicable to Tiruvidanger on the 15th of May 1903. This happened in Ernakulam. Better known by its popular name SNDP, the organization had Narayana Guru as president for life. Palpu and Ashan held, respectively, the offices of the vice president and secretary. The organization was set up, I quote from the application submitted to the government, was set up to promote and encourage religious and secular education and industrious habits among the Izhava community, unquote. This was mentioned in the application made to the Diwan on 8th of January 1903. The organization thus had caste wired into it from the very beginning. Palpu's brother Parameswaran and a certain Marthandan Krishnan were the applicants. Parameswaran, being the manager of the Aravipuram temple's property, the establishment of SNDP appeared to the world to be Narayana Guru's initiative rather than Palpu's. An impression reinforced by Palpu's conspicuous absence from the meeting of December 1902, when the decision to register the organization was taken. Guru's involvement with the SNDP at various levels brought major reforms among the Iravas. He cried halt to the practices such as the feast organized as a rite of passage when a girl attains puberty, and the Taligatu rite that follows, in which a man much older than the girl ties the knot to the girl in a symbolic gesture of marriage. He also transformed Irava marriage from a secular affair between two families, which were usually related to each other, to a sacrament involving vows, puja, and other ceremonies. He was instrumental in inaugurating a new practice in Kerala, which is now widely accepted across caste divisions. That is, holding the marriage ceremony in a temple. Narayana Guru was aware that the SNDP was meant to bring about reforms among the Iravas. That was the stated objective with which the organization was established. Before long, Narayana Guru began to get a wind of the deep-seated caste character of SNDP, which is to say the element of casteism in its functioning. It also turned out that the organization had begun to gradually stop taking him into confidence before arriving at important decisions. These were apparently the years when it occurred to him for the first time that building temples was a futile adventure, and that the temple was more likely to divide people on caste lines rather than unite them. This thought occurred to him after he built the Jagannatha temple in Talasheri, where he had a hard time convincing the Orthodox Iravas, or Tiyas as they are called in northern Malabar, to allow Pulayas enter the temple. He was now considering the choice of setting up another forum that was beyond caste and religious distinctions. Towards this end, he established the Advaita Ashrama in Aluva in 1913. The relationship with the SNDP leadership soared in the following years, leading to Guru's resignation from the organization. On 22nd May 1916, Narayana Guru wrote a letter to Palpu. I read the relevant portions from the letter. Since the resolutions of the Yogam are passed without our knowledge, and as there is no favor from the Yogam in matters pertaining to us, and as the Yogam's caste identity is increasing, as we have left the Yogam from our mind, now we have left the Yogam from speech and action also. Narayana Guru leaves the SNDP. 6 days later, on 28th May 1916, he released the following statement to the press. This is what he writes there. It is now some years since we have left caste and religious differences, yet we have come to know that certain special groups consider us as belonging to their group and act accordingly, and that because of this, some people have come to misunderstand our truth. We do not belong to any particular caste or religion. It has been stipulated specifically that such alone has been admitted to our successor disciples at the Advaita Ashrama at Aluva, and such alone shall be admitted to the body of disciples in future. This has been published for the knowledge of the public. Unquote. Attempts at a rapprochement were made in September that year when the SNDP sponsored the 60th birthday celebrations of Narayana Guru, the Shashti Purti. Celebrations were held widely across Kerala on 12th of September, with Irava temples holding special services and other events on the day. The Shashti Purti was also observed in parts of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, in cities such as Madras and Calcutta, and in Singapore and Sri Lanka. In the 2 months leading to the event, the SNDP built the Sri Narayana Shashti Purti Smaraka Mandiram in Thiruvananthapuram at a cost of over 8,000 rupees, inviting the Diwan Mannathu Krishnan Nair to inaugurate the building. Guru was perhaps not impressed. He is said to have brushed aside the event, saying jovially that his 60th birthday was already over some time ago. It may not be a coincidence that the year of his resignation from SNDP was also the year when he composed the most philosophical of his works, the Darshanamala, and wrote a poem called the Municharya Panchakam, laying out guidelines for ascetics. As it turns out, 1916 was also the year when he endorsed intercaste marriages for the first time. He has not left enough writings for us to trace the direction in which his mind was moving in these momentous years. He might have been thinking of greater independence in matters concerning worldly affairs without institutional dependence, or refining his acts on the lines of what W.H. Morris Johns has called the saintly idiom in Indian politics, as opposed to the mix of the modern and traditional idiom that characterized the SNDP. If the deeper recesses of his mind sought greater detachment from worldliness, his words and deeds point in the direction of greater involvement with them, with greater compassion and concern. We are trying to read the mind without enough resources to assist us. All these possibilities must therefore remain conjectural. It is worth asking if the developments of 1916 were the effects of his meeting with the most iconic of 20th century ascetics, Ramana Maharshi, in Tiruvannamalai in February that year. This is another question that cannot be answered satisfactorily. What can be said with certainty is that his worldview had changed in significant ways from the one that the Atmopadesha Shatakam had represented 2 decades earlier. He was not arriving at the understanding of the divine through the self anymore, as he had done in the Atmopadesha Shatakam. For as the Darshanamala makes it very clear, makes it amply clear, he now believed that the self, like the eyes, cannot see itself. Yata drigdrisham atmanam swayam atma na pashyati. The Darshanamala was an attempt to understand the divine as a means of understanding the self. Please note this difference. Please note this difference. In the Atmopadesha Shatakam, he was telling us that it is through the self that one can understand the divine. Now in the Darshanamala, he was telling us the opposite. The self cannot understand itself. One has to understand the self through the divine. As before, the divine pervaded the self and the world, but the differences were by no means trifling. The self was an active agent in the Atmopadesha Shatakam to the extent of being an active consciousness vis-a-vis the divine that was passive consciousness. Besides, creation, which Narayana Guru had hitherto attributed to various Pauranic deities in the stotras and stutis meant for temple worship, was a sui generis and unconscious aspect of nature. In the Darshanamala, agency came to be rested in the divine in the form of a force that inheres within. It identified karma as a non-substantial feature generated by the divine self, of which the individual self is a reflection, through a strange force called Shakti. The world, with all its beauty as well as with all its imperfection, so to speak, was the creation of the divine. The Darshanamala seems to have been a prefatory note to a phase in Narayana Guru's life that was characterized by a disillusionment with the divine in its Pauranic and other anthropomorphic forms. His attention turned to the divine as an abstract creative force imbued with maternal and paternal traits. The following times saw a redefinition of his presence in public life. In 1917, he declared that temples were centers that aggravated caste distinctions. He announced that temple building was a fruitless adventure and that the time had come to replace it with the establishment of schools. The SNDP made this declaration of Narayana Guru its official stand. After this date, Narayana Guru built no temples. At times, he was invited by others, mostly Eiravas, to install images in the temples that they had built. Guru was not enthusiastic about these invitations and accepted them only after he was cajoled into it. But having given up his truck with Shiva, Subramanya, Devi, Vishnu, and others of their ilk, he chose to reinvent the object of worship. In 1920, he installed a lamp as deity at a shrine at Karamukku, 5 kilometers south of Thrissur. In 1922, he placed a metal sheet made of the Panchaloha alloy with the words Satyam, Dharmam, Daya, and Sneham engraved on it for worship in the Kalakanteshwara temple at Murikumbura, 17 kilometers northwest of Thiruvananthapuram. And in 1927, he installed a mirror for worship in what became the Shaktishwaran temple in Kalangodam, 25 kilometers north of Alapura. These events of installing lamp, mirror, and the metal sheet are well known. But in existing assessments of Narayana Guru's life, they are mostly discussed without attention to context or chronology. But as it turns out, these were moves that were specific to the last decade of his life, when Narayana Guru's mind was very different from what it was in the spring of 1888. He spent the last years of his life traveling and dividing time between his seats in Shivagiri and Alua. He paid 2 visits to Sri Lanka in these years, the first in 1918 and the second in 1923. In 1921, he organized a conference on brotherhood at the Advaita Ashrama in Alua, which was also the venue for a conference of all religions in 1924. I am almost on the last leg of the talk, maybe 2 minutes more. The SNDP was making waves in these years thanks to the work of T.K. Madhavan, a member of the Thiruvidankur Legislative Assembly and a pioneer of the temple entry movement in Kerala. Madhavan organized the famous Vaikam Satyagraha in 1924, demanding access to all communities to the public road around the Mahadeva temple in Vaikam. With Mahatma Gandhi accepting Madhavan's invitation to participate in it, the Satyagraha made waves across India. Among the participants in the Vaikam Satyagraha were Periyar, E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, Mannathu Padmanabhan and K. Kelappan. Narayana Guru visited Vaikam and announced his support to the movement. The Satyagraha lasted for 604 days. When it was called off on 23rd November 1925, the settlement arrived at between the government and the Satyagrahis led by Gandhi, granting unrestricted access to roads on 3 of the 4 sites of the temple to all people, was hailed as a major success. We do not know what the Guru felt about the settlement, as one of the roads around the Vaikam temple was still out of bounds for the lower castes. We do not also know what he thought of the changing fortunes of the SNDP under Madhavan's charismatic leadership. From a membership of 900 in 1909, the SNDP had grown in strength to 4,200 in 1927, when Madhavan took over as General Secretary of the organization. In less than 18 months, Madhavan increased its membership to 50,000, 50,000. Narayana Guru was an idealist, but his idealism was characterized by concerns that were pragmatic and initiatives that were radical when examined from within the constitutive logic of the caste system. He never campaigned for the commensality movement and is not known to have pressed for the formal abolition of untouchability. These might have appeared to him as symbolic gestures lacking in substance, for Thiruvidankur had in the 19th century passed many a progressive proclamation that did not bring about visible changes in the lives of the downtrodden, at least in the immediate years and decades that followed. Narayana Guru believed that reform in the caste structure should take the route of education and economic security, from which eradication of taboos that inhibit commensality and promote untouchability shall follow. Guru was not enthusiastic about the temple entry movement either. The movement might have appeared to him as an endorsement of existing ideational hegemonies in the praxis of religion. The alternative that he invented was to set up parallel public shrines that did not follow scriptural directions and accepted modes of worship. He rejected long-standing prayers, hymns, songs, and liturgies from the Vedas, Agamas, and other sacred texts, composing in their stead verses of his own for use in the temples that he had established. He also cried halt to animal sacrifice and offering of liquor and meat, expelling deities that sought such offerings. All that he did not choose to accomplish was reject the Puranic deities, Shiva, Subramanya, Vishnu, Kali, Ganapati, Devi, and invent divinities of his own to replace them. A thought in this direction might have certainly occurred to him in the last decade of his life when he stopped building temple. He did not invent a new deity for sure. In his last years, when he accepted a few invitations to install images in shrines that some Eiravas had built recently, it was, as we saw, objects such as lamps and mirrors that he chose to install on the pedestal meant for the deity. His mind seems to have gradually distanced itself from Shivas and Vishnus and Devis and Subramanyas. Guru's changed attitude towards the Puranic deities may not have been an abrupt change that occurred in 1917 when he declared that temple building was a futile endeavor. He is likely to have pondered over the matter for several years before. We notice that he did not compose a single hymn in praise of a Puranic deity after 1897. He wrote only 2 pieces of prayer after this date, the Janani Navaratna Manjari of 1909, addressed to the Mother Divine, Janani, and the Daiva Dashakam of 1914, addressed to God, Daivam, the Father Divine, who is addressed variously as Lord, Tamburan, possessor of fortune, Bhagavan, and the great God, Mahadeva. The last of these, incidentally, a name of Shiva. Narayana Guru had come a long way in the 4 decades since he installed the Shivalinga in Aravipuram. The deities that he once worshipped were not in his mind anymore, even though he disavowed them only with his silences and not with his words. But this long journey had transformed him, unfortunately, into a deity, and more unfortunately, of a specific caste. Biographies with thinly veiled flourishes of hagiography were already being composed for him in his lifetime, and events, committees, and buildings named after him. It is with more than a heavy heart that he breathed his last in Shivagiri on 20th September 1928, a year after the first of his countless statues were unveiled in Talasheri, where in 1908, many Iravas had objected to the entry of Pulayas into a temple that he had built. Today, Kerala abounds with statues of Narayana Guru, mostly made of cement. There is no smile on the lips of these statues, no spark of divinity on their face. And in the frozen eyes of these statues, these cement statues, there is one emotion that is hard to miss: fathomless sorrow. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for this insightful lecture. It was indeed a very engaging to hear about Guru's life and to know about different worldviews which influenced him and shaped his understanding and philosophy of life, and how that precipitated his social actions and affairs and different shifts in his ideology and philosophical approaches and social affairs. Thank you, sir. Now I think we can go for the discussion. I think the session is now open for discussion. Anyone with doubts and questions can post them on the chat box. Sir, can we go for the questions?
Dr. Manu,
Shiva, tell me. Yeah.
yes, can Ajay read out the questions to you from the chat box?
Yes.
Please, Ajay.
Okay, sir. Okay. So the first question is from Ambarna. She's a research scholar in our department. Her question is, sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Her first question is, can we identify any incident in Srinarayana Guru's life that caused him to actively involve in the social reform movement of the period?
We do not really know much about the first 3 decades of his life, as I mentioned earlier, and what little has been written about it in the biographies, many of them written during his lifetime itself. We already have a biography composed by Kumaranashan and several others, Murkothu Kumaran, for instance. What we learn from these earlier biographies is that he was really distressed, even as a young boy, with the situation that he found the Pulayas of Chembarandi in, the levels of untouchability, and many of the young children working as farm laborers, even on his own field. But apart from these anecdotal instances, it's very difficult to tell us what actually was guiding his mind in these early years, because we do not really have the information, and Guru himself has not told us much about it.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Next question is from Nidin A. He is also an MPhil scholar of the department. His question is, despite being a believer of Vedic philosophies, why was he called the second Buddha? How did his philosophies come to be accepted in Sri Lanka?
Well, I don't know whether he believed in Vedic philosophies, because there is a very clear difference between Vedas, which encouraged animal sacrifices and things like that, and the Upanishads, in which we hear a dissenting voice against what is generally believed as Vedic philosophy. He was more drawn towards the Upanishadic kind of understanding. And I do not know if the image of a second Buddha was widely popular. Of course, he is often, he's at least on some occasions regarded as a second Buddha, but that may not be a widely popular image that we know of.
Okay, sir. Next question is from Chinas. His question is, Guru's conceptual shift from the self, from the Atmopadesha Shastram to Darshanamala is a silent point and needs profound study on his changing intellectual disposition.
No, that's a comment, I guess. I welcome the comment.
Yes,
it's not a question.
yes. Next question is from Gayatri Warrior. In the global national level, the Guru is often known only as a social reformer. How much of his broader philosophy and vision is neglected by this?
As I told you in the beginning, there are very different ways in which he has been understood. There is, in fact, one school of thought within the SNDP itself, if not the SNDP, at least the lineages following through Nataraja Guru, Nitya Chaitanya Yati, and so on, which does not take the social reformer aspect very seriously. They would like to consider Guru more as a philosopher who has some kind of a continuity with the Upanishadic and Advaitic learning, as well as the Tamil Siddha learning. So that trajectory is also very much there. And I, for one, believe that at least his philosophical writings, particularly the Atmopadesha Shadakam and Darshanamala, have not been very seriously studied by serious academicians. They have been widely commented upon by political analysts and by people from within the SNDP tradition. But otherwise, mostly what we find is anecdotal references here and there, and their use. Jati Vedam Madadvesham would be one of them. And there are similar other stanzas from here and there which they pick up at convenience, rather than engage systematically with the structure of his philosophy itself. And that is when you understand how different his views in the Darshanamala are vis-a-vis what he had spoken earlier in the Atmopadesha Shatakam. I think it needs very serious examination.
Okay, sir. Thank you. There is another question from Abarna. In Arivipuram, did his concentration of Eva Shiva strengthen the caste identities further in the later years?
I don't know if Narayana Guru was a big enthusiast in this direction. At least from what little we know from his own words from a later period, he had tried to at least distance from his caste identity. And when he was closely associated with the caste, as he was at least in the first decade of the 1900s, he was more a reformer. He was trying to reform many of the rites of passages primarily, but also several other practices, introducing certain elements of puja and so on and so forth. It is particularly after the involvement of Dr. Palpu that it takes on a very strong caste character. I don't think Narayana Guru's work itself may represent some kind of an Irava resurgence. So that may not be true.
Okay, sir, that's clear. As Santosh Aled has put forward a question that, as you have noted, there are more than 30 biographies of Guru. Many of them draw parallel from the life of Jesus Christ during patience, Muhammad retiring to cave, etc. And as noted, second Buddha. Why does this happen? Why does we can see this trend?
One of the things is that at least in modern Kerala, at least in the last 50 years or so, I don't think people consider Narayana Guru as a miracle worker. Maybe that was the case in his own lifetime when literacy was what it used to be later. But in most of the biographies, hagiographies, so to speak, of whether Muhammad or Christ or Buddha himself, you do have a very prominent presence for the miracles that they performed. Now, what are the miracles? Normally, we can actually rationally understand what they are. They either cause a water tank to be built or they cause rain. That is another thing. they cure diseases, they cure people of various illnesses and diseases, which actually shows some very close engagement which the people had with them, which, given the kind of rationality that prevailed among the illiterate classes, might have been regarded as miracles. So I don't think anybody in Kerala now believes that the acts of Narayana Guru of curing people were miracles, actually, because he had his background, he had his training in Ayurveda, although not formal training. It's an informal training that he had from his uncle, particularly Krishnan Vaidya. That must have actually helped him. And maybe during his own lifetime in the 1910s and 20s, some people might have regarded this as miracles, but I don't think that image persists down to this day.
Okay, sir. Moving to the next question, Jayanti Chami has posted that, is the slogan "One caste, one religion, one God" through lights on the universality of religion, on his universality of religion?
Yes, it does, I guess. It does.
Yes, yes. Next question is from Abu Bakr Siddiq. Could you please explain how lamp becomes a symbol of divinity in Guru's path as well as other Indian mystics?
Lamp, I don't think, was the only symbol that Guru used. Of course, there was also the mirror in one place. There was the Panchaloha metal piece on which he engraved a few letters, Satyam, Dharmam, Shanti. So lamp is not the only thing that is important for Guru. And this is again in the last phase of his life, beginning with 1920 or so, by which time he had himself stopped building temples. He had stopped patronizing Shiva and Vishnu and Subramanya and Ganapati, Devi, so on. So he was having a very different image of the divine. And he was actually trying to identify certain symbols that could actually represent the more abstract form of divine that was now going through his mind.
Okay, so Jayanti also had another question. SNDP created by Guru is different from the modern SNDP. How far is true? Is it more away from the concept of social reform?
I don't know if there is an SNDP now. There is a microfinance group that is functional today, which is very different from the SNDP of Narayana Guru's times. We should make a very clear distinction between that.
Yes, sir. Sharif has another question. As you said, he was parallel to the existing hegemonical religious practices rather than imitating. So was he propagating a non-Brahminical way of spirituality?
I'm very skeptical about this whole idea of Brahminical, because one of my students is actually doing his research on Bengal and Orissa for the early medieval period, and he has come up with something that is fascinating. He is going by available statistics in terms of land donations being made to various Brahmana groups, that is the Brahmadaya grants, which are called Agrahara grants in those parts of the country. And what he notices is that in places where you have the densest concentration of these, for example, in the Ganjam district of southern Odisha and the adjoining Srikakulam district of Andhra, there is one area where you have something like 130 copper plate inscriptions between 600 and 1000 AD, making grants to Brahmanas. This is the largest number in the whole of India in terms of copper plate grants for a very short period, 400 years. And this is also the area, one of the areas, according to the 1901 census, one of the most densest population of Brahmanas are found in these areas. Tanjavur, the Ganjam area, and South Canara. This is where you have the greatest concentration. And what he finds is that before the 19th century, there are only 3 temples built here. Only 3 temples built here. Whereas you go to another area where you almost have no Brahmins, you have something like 25 temples built within a period of 25 or 30 years. So this association that we make between Brahminical and temple worship needs to be seriously challenged. I think it's Pauranic worship and it needs to be understood as such. Only because the priest is a Brahmin does not make it a Brahminical institution. We need to see who are patronizing this, who are funding this. The situation is far more complex than the simple Brahmin, non-Brahmin trend seems to represent. So that may apply in this situation as well. So I would not actually say that Narayana Guru was promoting a Brahminical or a non-Brahminical form of worship. Narayana Guru was certainly following agamic forms, but he was not borrowing from the agamas themselves. He was creating his own hymns. He was creating his own stotras. He was changing it substantially, to suit the very particular requirements, in the course of which he challenged the existing hegemonies. because there are certain prescriptions that one needs to follow. You cannot become a sannyasi without a diksha. He becomes a sannyasi without diksha. You cannot establish a temple in Kerala without the Tantra Samuchayam. He establishes a temple without a Tantra Samuchayam. So he's certainly going against the hegemonic classes. But to bring it into the Brahmin non-Brahmin debate, I think is not very helpful.
Okay, sir, I hope that answers the question. Santosh Ladata has also raised another question. As you noted, there is a change from Irava Shiva to Nammuda Shiva in the biographies. What do you think is the cause of this change?
I don't know when it actually starts. You know, the earliest that I can trace is this 1986 feature film by P.A. Bakkar, Sri Narayana Guru. That's the name of the film. That is the film where I have come across the first reference to Guru saying that it is Nammuda Shivan that is installing, not an Irava Shiva. Maybe somebody has written about that in earlier decades, maybe in the 60s or 70s, but I have not been able to trace any writing. I believe it is an attempt to represent Guru as a little more secular or little less casteist and so on. I think that those apprehensions are not necessary, but because nobody regards Narayana Guru as a casteist. He must have worked for the Iravas, that's his own community, that wouldn't actually make him a casteist. So that apprehensions, I guess, are misplaced. So if he said that it was Irava Shiva, I think we need to maintain that.
Okay. There's one last question from Divya Subran. Which is, I think it's a general question. Why the most of the social reformers being recognized as God in late stage?
Because somehow they come to be appropriated by the community to which they belong, which is very unfortunate actually. But it does happen. The communities appropriate them for themselves, and it becomes a kind of explanation as well as to why their own community is great. You know, here is a man from our community who is propagating ideals of universality, who is telling us that there is no distinction between caste or religion, and for that reason, our community is great. You know, that gets wired into it for good or for bad. It happens with everybody.
Dr. Manu, there's a question from the YouTube live chat box. Yeah, it's Dr. Sheila Mary Varghese. The question is, did Iravas have access to Sanskrit knowledge systems by the end of the 19th century?
They did.
There's another question.
You also had schools, you know, the schools of Ramanashan, for example, is one such school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another question from Dr. Sheila Mary Varghese herself. It also seems like Guru was Sanskritizing the Irava fold, striving for upward social mobility as he replaced the indigenous deities with Brahmanic ones. That's a comment.
I think in retrospect, we can make that argument that he was actually trying to Brahmanize them or Pauranize them or whatever you want to call it. Nomenclatures notwithstanding, that argument can in fact be made at least about a particular phase in Guru's life extending up to 1916. But after that, we do see him change.
Dr. Manu, I have a question. It's like this. Before Sri Narayana Guru started talking about these issues, there was Vaikunta Samigal who actually started off with the mirror,
Yeah, Vaikunta. Yes.
So isn't it also connected with a sense of a self and the individual that emerged within the context of modernity? So how do you look at that?
It is. You have traces of that not just in Kerala but also in, for example, in the works of Mahima Gosai, who is the founder of the Mahima Dharma in Odisha. He also lived sometime in the 1850s and 1860s and so on. We do have that element of individuality emerging there. And I, for one, am really skeptical of this whole idea that it is the introduction of English education or colonial governmentality or whatever which introduced this kind of individualism, because this kind of individualism is mostly noted, if you look at it much more carefully, in the what we now call the subaltern classes. When you come to Karnataka, it is the Tattvapada traditions of the 18th and 19th century, where we have this very powerful self. If you go to Kerala, it is in the Theyyams, Theyyam and Thottampattu, you have very strong, very powerful individuality being represented there. So I think there is an alternative trajectory for the evolution of a sense of individuality, a sense of selfhood, which need not be a civic individuation. it need not be civic individuation, but the sense of individuality is certainly there. That somehow dovetails with the modern individuality which education and other things introduce. But there's certainly another trajectory, and Ayya Vaikuntan, I guess, would represent that trajectory.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. I quite appreciate that comment.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have.
Ajay, there is a comment from Anish, and yeah. The comment is understanding M.N. Srinivas's Sanskritization may not be productive.
Yeah, what is interesting is that M.N. Srinivas gets the idea of Sanskritization from Narayana Guru, or at least from SNDP. You know, there used to be a conference held every year in Madras in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. This is something like your Indian Social Science Congress or something like that, where representatives not only from the academia but also from various caste groups and civil society organizations would participate. And there was the SNDP representation there. And one of the things they often pressed there was that we have to emulate the ideas of at least the ways and behaviors, the language, etc. of the upper castes. And one of the participants in this conference was M.N. Srinivas, who was called M.N. Srinivas Iyengar at those days. He drops the Iyengar at a later phase, and he gets the idea from there, which of course he refines it according to the existing protocols in sociology. But I agree that Sanskritization may not be a good idea to understand Guru, but Srinivas gets it from the Guru, not from Guru, but from SNDP.
Thank you. I hope we have almost answered every question.
Ajay, your voice is breaking, Ajay. Can you speak again?
Okay. I think we have almost covered every questions. Right. Yes. It was indeed a very wonderful discussion. Thank you, sir, for answering all the questions so patiently. And I would like to thank you once again for this enriched and enlightening lecture. And on the behalf of Srinarayana University and the Department of History, I extend my sincere gratitude to you, sir. And without active participation of audience on an academic discussion is never complete. So I heartily thankful this participation from all of our audience, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Dr. Shiba. It was
Thank
wonderful.
you, Dr. Manu.
It was wonderful being here. Thank you
for
very much.
being here. Very enlightening. Thank you so much. Thank you all participants. We meet again tomorrow, 6 p.m. same time. Bye.
Okay.
Bye. Thanks.